So let's talk about Generation X. They were born from 61 to 81. Their current ages are 33 to 53. And they're called X, and boy, they really resent this, but they're called X because of their lack of generational cohorts. They didn't have those big events that tied them together, the way obviously World War II tied together the boomer, that generation, what they now call the greatest generation. We've had 9/11, the assassination of Kennedy, that sort of thing. Those are things that give strong self-identification to generations. Generation X was said not to have such generational cohorts. The generational values that affect core values, likes and dislikes, are the very important things that we have to look at with respect to Generation X. First of all, divorce rates. They had the highest divorce rates of any generation so far. The reason divorce rates are so important is because when you're engaged in divorce, that's just about the worst impression you ever get of the legal system, of the justice system. Few people ever walk out of a divorce court after a long bloody battle in divorce and say, well, I got justice. So it's a very bad impression of the entire judicial system. Not only your generation getting more divorces, but you see your parents getting divorced. When you're the children of divorce, you have the same types of problems, of a bad impression of the judicial system. Generation X had more children out of wedlock than any generation in history. They had an increased number of absent fathers, and that started tearing at the core values, the family unit. Which is often very important. Maintaining the family unit, or the value of the family unit, is often very important in our proof in wrongful death cases of a family member, things of that nature. The Generation X, their social phenomena is aside from the divorce rate, but they ended up with disrespect for divorce laws. But then they had something that was much more important to them. They were the first generation that had a dwindling education. The generation before them, the boomers, had the advantage of the GI Bill. So they had they had a huge influx into the colleges from the boomer generation because they had the GI Bill and they had a lot of educational opportunities. Plus, there were less of them than there are Generation X. Gen X has the high crime rate, the highest crime rate. It was just increasing all over the country. The characteristics of stability. What they seek coming out of all this mess that they were raised in is they seek balance and perspective. And they put emphasis on leisure and entertainment because they saw their parents working and they saw a lot of broken families. And they saw the breakup of the basic family unit in a lot of homes. And so they're now looking for leisure and entertainment. They were the first generation that went back in and had a home office, the idea of a home office. Previous generations didn't have an office at home. A lot of these people did have a home office. And a lot of it was because of the employment situation that they faced. They had to work at home. Stability. They were the first generation that started staying home longer. And they were closer to their parents. And they postponed independent living. And so that has an effect now that if you're talking about Generation X, you have to remember that if you're trying a death case involving the death of a parent, that Generation X, 51% admire their parents the most, and they take responsibility for their aging parents more than previous generations ever did. And one of the reasons they admire their parents most is because they came back home and spent more time with them. They stayed with them longer. A lot of them average up to age 28. At home, whereas previous generations, they were leaving home at 18, 19, 20, and staying away, starting their own lives. But Gen X came back home after college even. And so they have a much closer relationship with their parents, which is very important when you start talking about evidence of the proof that as a result of a tragedy that occurred, the family unit has been broken up. And the parents, a loss of a parent or the loss of a child, is very important. The self-reliance, now this is a very big theme, and you're going to think about this as you go through this, because this is the generation that Karl Rove and others decided were the perfect targets for tort reform. And they were absolutely right. These people were the targets of tort reform because they were preconditioned, because of these generational cohorts and so forth, they were preconditioned to believe in the rhetoric of tort reform, starting with self-reliance. They were in a situation, unlike previous generations, where both parents were working outside the home. The basic family unit of dad going off to work, the TV family. Dad going off to work, mom staying home, taking care of the kids, having dinner on the table at night, everybody sitting down to the dinner table together at night, having breakfast together in the morning, church together on Sunday. That went away, beginning with Generation X in a big way. Both parents were working outside the home. This generation grew up extremely independent, and as a result, they became very self-reliant. Another big impact on them were the Reagan social cuts. When Reagan took office, did away with all the social assistance from the federal government, essentially, they were left with the opinion that, okay, I've got to take care of myself because nobody's going to take care of me. And so here comes the biggest theme in the courtroom today. It grew out of this generation. Personal responsibility. I think personal responsibility is the biggest single theme in the courtroom today in personal injury litigation. Everybody wants to wrap their arms around personal responsibility. As a plaintiff's attorney, you need to make personal responsibility your theme, and boy, especially with Generation X, because these people invented personal responsibility. And Rove and the other forces of evil understood how susceptible this generation would be in tort reform to the concept of self-reliance and the concept of personal responsibility. So they made personal responsibility the central theme, except they adopted it for the defense. They made personal responsibility the theme in this fashion, that why are you coming to asking me as a juror to take care of you? You should be taking care of yourself. I took care of myself because my parents were outside the home. We had cuts. I couldn't get a job. I had to work out of a home office that doing a sales job or whatever. I didn't have those opportunities. Why aren't you taking care of yourself? I'm personally responsible, so should you be. All right, that was the heart of tort reform and remains so today. But you have to turn this around. You have to turn this around on voir dire examination and very early in the trial. You have to make, with the opportunity to speak first on behalf of the plaintiff, we have to make personal responsibility our theme. And you do that by telling people on voir dire examination that Mr. Jones, the plaintiff in this case, ask that you carefully examine his conduct in this case. And he takes personal responsibility for all of his own actions in this case. And the reason we're here today is because this defendant refuses to take personal responsibility for their actions, for their decision to drive in excess of the speed limit, to break the rule regarding travel, speed in this country. And they will not take responsibility for this. We're going to call upon you to place personal responsibility on this defendant by returning a jury or whatever. Okay, but the whole idea is you take personal responsibility, right? Take it off the bat so before they get a chance to do it. Now, Gen X was of the opinion that they could not rely on the government. They went through 8 years of Reagan, 4 years of Bush, with little or no help from the federal government. They had to take care of their own health care, a very important issue today and then and since then. They had to take care of their own health care. Think about how that resonates with them. When you're asking them to provide money for your client's health care, for future health care, for what's been done to them in the past, they're saying, wait a minute, I provide for my own health care, why don't you? Self-reliance. They have no deference to authority. The breakdown in authority began with the high divorce rate, with bad attitudes about the court. And then it really came about as a result of, as much as anything else, tort reform, by being pounded constantly by tort reformers and being told that you can't rely on the judicial system, you can't believe in judges, you can't believe in jurors, nobody is going to be doing anything for you, you have to do things for yourself, you're totally personally responsible for your own life. And so they end up with absolutely no deference to authority. In the employment situation, this generation had no job security, none. They had no confidence that they could keep a job if they got one. Their job security was completely up for grabs. There were attacks made. This is when there were very, very strong attacks made as part of tort reform. Tort reform was an attack on the trial lawyers, on the judicial system, but it was also an attack on the unions. And so as the unions' power diminished, so did job security for people who would have ordinarily been union members. So this generation had less job security. They were the first declining wage generation. And again, part of that is because of the success of tort reform in fighting the unions and in fighting the judicial system. But they had declining wages. So if you're going to go in and try to prove to a Generation X member that your client has a problem because they can't get a job, or because since they were injured, they have no job security now, they can't depend on keeping the job they have because they're injured, or because they're injured, they're not making as much money now as they made before, they say, welcome to my world. And so you really have to keep this in mind when you're picking juries, that you're not going to get nearly as much empathy from Generation X on a big wage loss case, a big economic damage case as a result of a personal injury, as you might from a different generation. Politics, they're the post-Nixon attitude towards politics. This is when they basically disengaged. They had a weak attachment to political parties. They watched all the television of the whole Nixon hearings, and then they saw all the things that followed that. Politicians went to jail, and they just weren't interested in it. Plus, that combined with the fact that politicians weren't doing anything for them anyway, with all the Reagan cuts. So they detached from political parties. They have the lowest, today still, generally they have the lowest voter participation, and they have no belief in politicians. The X factor. What are the characteristics of Generation X? Well, the X factor is the fact that they didn't have a common enemy. They had no clear idea of who they are. They have no clear rallying points, and they have no clear national principles, because they had no clear national leadership that were creating and applying principles that would apply to them. It was hard to discern clear national principles when they grew up in that whole morass of Nixon and the whole fighting in Washington. Now, if you remember, this is a generational thing. If you go back and pick some individual people from Generation X and what Generation X produced for this country, individually, phenomenal. phenomenal. There's been huge success emanating directly from Generation X members. But these are general propositions, general characteristics of the generation as a whole. They certainly do not apply to every member of that generation, but they're just attitudes. The core values are different here than they are from other generations. Time magazine, you call us slackers, dismissed us as Generation X, and they were very obviously upset by it, and with good reason. Now, under diversity, they became more tolerant of people who were not exactly like them. They're more ethnically diverse, and they had more ethnic acceptance. And the thing that carries that forward that's very, very important in this country on ethnic acceptance has been music. The way music crosses across every generation and appeals across generational lines, and it appeals across ethnic lines, and it appeals across all kinds of lines. So there was more diversity in Generation X, more tolerant. And then Generation X women, you'll remember, they placed greater importance on the home and the family that they missed. Remember, they're from the broken home. They're from the highest divorce rate. They're from the two parents working outside the home. So they put far greater importance. This is not going to happen to us. They put greater importance on their home and on their families. So Gen X women could be a very good choice from a characteristic viewpoint, generational characteristic viewpoint. If you have a case in which the family has been destroyed or the family has been severely damaged by the negligence of the other party, because home and family are important. This generation refused to compromise family and quality of life for a career. They were not the ambitious go-getter, let's break through the glass ceiling. They were more in terms of let's raise a good, solid, educated family so that the next generation will be better than ours and have better income, have better education, have better and greater opportunities at every level. So generational X women are something pretty special that you have to keep in mind when you're picking a jury. They disavow the association with feminism. This is not the brow burners, but they're the daughters of those boomer feminists. The feminists were the boomers, but they claim the benefits that they got from the boomers, but they disavow the associations with them. Now, this is why there's another reason why there's such a really good target for tort reform. They ended up with a conservative mentality. They're very cautious and practical. And they had so much hype and insincerity. They saw so much insincerity coming out of the politicians, I think, more than anything else in their generation. So they reject hype and insincerity. They reject overstatement and flash. Keep this in mind when you're thinking about your demonstrative evidence, when you're thinking about your closing arguments, when you're thinking about hyperbole. When you stand up and talk in terms of the hyperbolic general statements, that overstatement is rejected by this conservative mentality, as it should be. I mean, overstatement and flash should be rejected by everybody, but these people are very, very much opposed. They're very attuned to it, the Generation X. They resist conspicuous consumption. They're more conservative than the boomers, this is where they were really tapped into. This generation was heavily tapped into by Reagan. He cut them off from the benefits of the federal government, but a lot of these folks followed Reagan, and they got caught up in the Republican conservative movement. They're skeptical towards blind liberalism. The boomers were the idealistic blind liberals.